Hello, everybody. We are the students of Willy Brandt School, and welcome to our podcast through the lens of the UN. In a short while, you will listen to the most pressuring issues around the world from the United Nations perspective.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast, Through the Lens, which discusses how the UN deals with the most pressing global issues. This is John and Kami here today. Let's start off with some introductions. So, I'm from the United States, and I'm studying public policy with specializations in development and socioeconomic policy and nonprofit and social entrepreneurship.
And I'm Kami, here from Russia. I'm studying public policy too, with specialization in conflict studies and management and nonprofit and social entrepreneurship.
Okay, so Kami, what are we going to be covering today?
Today we're looking at two United Nations resolutions from the 2020 General Assembly, the trafficking in women and girls and child early and forced marriage.
Right, okay then. So, Kami, let me start off by giving the definition for trafficking. According to the UN, trafficking is the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of people through force, fraud, or deception with the aim of exploiting them for profit. Men, women, and children of all ages and from all backgrounds can become victims of this crime, which occurs in every region of the world. The traffickers often use violence or fraudulent employment agencies and fake promises of education and job opportunities to trick and coerce their victims.
Okay, and now that happens all over the world, right? And who are the trafficker? Is it organized criminal gangs, right?
Yeah, so you're right about where it happens. Generally, we find detected trafficking victims flowing from economically disadvantaged places to more prosperous parts of the world. But as for who does it, yeah, organized criminal gangs are often culprits, but we also see three other types of perpetrators. We have individuals who often operate only when the opportunity presents itself, opportunistic associations of traffickers, which are usually two traffickers operating together, generally in an informal manner. Finally, we have governance type of organized criminal groups. These are groups, either governmental or paramilitary, who traffic humans as a means of quelling dissent and maintaining power through the use of fear and violence.
Mhm. It's also necessary to define our second topic. When it comes to child early and forced marriage, the United Nations has defined it as the marriage that takes place without the free or valid consent of the one or both of the partners and involves either physical or emotional duties. Early marriage is related to the forced marriage because minors are deemed incapable of giving informed consent.
Okay, so Kami, after a quick break, we should jump into these resolutions and see how the UN tries to combat international crimes and human rights violations. All right, so let's start with a little history lesson. The UN has been involved in combating human trafficking since its inception. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights mentioned a few things related to trafficking and forced marriage way back in 1948. It called for the end of slavery and the slave trade. It called for freedom of people to choose their own work, and it declared marriage as something to be entered into only by the free and full consent of both parties. In 1949, the Convention for the Suppression of the Traffic in Persons and Exploitation of Prostitution of Others was adopted. Modern efforts really solidified in 2000 with the Palermo Protocols. The planning for the Palermo Protocols really started in 1998. The UN established an ad hoc committee to negotiate an international convention and related protocols to combat transnational organized crime. In 2000, the General Assembly adopted the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime and additional optional protocols against trafficking in persons and smuggling migrants. That's a lot to say, so it's just referred to as the Palermo Protocols. This culminated a decades-long effort. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime also released its biennial report on human trafficking. This report is perhaps the most important document that the UN has released on human trafficking, as it reports on global trends, causes, and thoroughly breaks down the data, offering a better picture of who is trafficked, who are the traffickers, and best practices for combating human trafficking.
I think there is something called the four Ps. What are they?
Right, so the four Ps are the four parts of the UN Plan of Action to combat human trafficking. They are prevention, protection and assistance to victims, prosecution of the crimes of trafficking and partnerships, And they are all part of the 2010 UN Global Plan of Action to Combat Human Trafficking in Persons, which was basically a renewed commitment 10 years later of the Palermo Protocols. The plan also requested that the UN Office on Drugs and Crime strengthen their information collection abilities.
I think my biggest takeaway when reading the United Nations ODC research was just how often the word detected was used. It was really striking how much trafficking is still hidden, right? It's a crime that really does prey on the most invisible people, especially women and girls, in places where women and girls are already marginalized, where education is lacking and poverty is widespread, and when traffic victims are often unable or scared to contact authorities in the country they are trafficked into. Traffickers use violence or the threat of violence to keep their victims invisible, and often, even if it isn't the case, the victims lack the communication skills or are fearful of authorities. Even the worst circumstances, often the unknown is far scarier.
Actually, yeah. So in 2014, the US government advised reporters not to use estimated numbers when they report on human trafficking. That is just how bad the numbers are. The US government feels the need to caution reporters that their stories might be inadvertently inaccurate if they try and peg an estimate. Oftentimes, trafficked victims are also pushed to do illegal activities. The most obvious of these is, of course, prostitution. This might be the most visible crime that trafficking victims are forced to commit. Incidentally, trafficking victims forced into prostitution may be overrepresented in the data because their presence is so obvious and they do tend to garner the most media attention. But outside of prostitution, some trafficking victims are forced into other criminal pursuits, like pickpocketing or begging. These sorts of crimes are particularly relevant when it comes to child victims. One of the things the UN really pushes for is for countries to be lenient when it comes to crimes committed by trafficking victims. But Kami, speaking of other reasons, 1% of human trafficking victims are forced into marriage. You've read a bit about that, right? So how does the UN combat child early and forced marriage?
So, like the Trafficking of Women and Girls resolution, the resolution on child early and forced marriage is also an annual resolution in the 75th General Assembly. It was introduced by a group of 80 countries, with the 35 other countries co-sponsoring the resolution. It part of the raft of the resolutions retraining the rights of the children. There was a bit of debate before it finally passed by the consensus.
And what kind of debate was there?
Oh, it was really most focused on the some worlding issues, while the United States objected to the use of the terms like reproductive health.
Uh-huh. And what does the resolution say?
Well, luckily, we have seen a reduction in child early and forced marriage throughout the world. The number of girls married before the age of 18 has dropped from 1 in 4 a decade ago and to 1 in 5 now. Obviously, the world has a way to go, but it's definitely a progress.
Oh, yeah, that is progress. But Kami, a lot of the research the UN has done on trafficking shows a real correlation between things like GDP and employment on trafficking. Is the same true for child marriage?
Unfortunately, yes. And the economic crisis that the coronavirus pandemic has brought means we will likely see an extra 30 million child early and forced marriages in the coming decade.
Wow. Now, with human trafficking, we see from the data that Asia is the home of the widest array of human trafficking victims, while Europe receives victims from the most places. I guess my question would be, where is child early and forced marriage happening? Is it a global issue?
Yes, unfortunately, yes. Part of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals for 2030 is the elimination of child early and forced marriage. And the United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner says that there is no region in the globe that is on track to meet that goal. But the practice is especially prevalent in the South Asia, where 44 of victims live, and the Sub-Sahara Africa, where about 20% of the victims live.
Huh. And what recommendations has the UN released to combat child early and forced marriage?
Well, to be honest, in many parts of the world, it's endemic because it's a traditional practice, making it much harder to eradicate. It seems so simple, but one of the things that United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner calls on nations to do is to make it easier to end a child marriage. Many girls, once married, face nearly unsurmountable odds to have the marriage recognized as ended. United Nations also recognized that the issue must be addressed in the context of the local cultural practices and therefore calls on the countries to really approach the issue holistically. Essentially, a shift to the culture is needed.
Right. I think the Office of the High Commission also called for the improvements of the rights and opportunities for women and girls. So empowering these girls and working to provide education and opportunities.
Yes, exactly. Really, a lot of the ways to combat child early and forced marriage are also ways to combat the root causes of trafficking.
Right, yeah. Okay then. So when we come back, let's look at why these issues are so important.
John, why do you think the issue of human trafficking in women and girls and child forced marriage is a crucial issue to discuss? And why there is still not enough data on these topics?
Well, first of all, these issues have a huge impact on the physical and mental health of victims, starting from the physical abuse and torture of victims to the psychological and emotional trauma. Also, these issues relate to the economic and political implications of unabated crime, and the impact on individuals and society is clearly destructive and unacceptable. And if we talk about how many people are affected by these crimes, the issue becomes global and it affects a lot of people. When we look at the statistics provided by the United Nations, 2.4 million people have been trafficked into forced labor worldwide that we know of. 70% of the human trafficking victims are women and girls. When it comes to child marriage facts, by one estimate, 650 million women and girls alive today were married as children. Also, each year, another 12 million girls under the age of 18 become child brides. In the time we've discussed these numbers, another 5 girls were married. The resolution also mentions the impact of COVID 19, which will lead to an increase of the numbers.
Those numbers are really shocking. I worry though that talking about millions of people we might miss the bigger picture, which is how forced marriage really affects person. Do you have any stories about individual survivors?
Well, we do. So, one story that really stood out to me was the story of someone we'll call Gloria. She became a child bride at the age of 12 to a 35-year-old man. She was forced to marry him due to poverty. She was told the marriage would save her mother and her siblings. However, she lost her freedom. She was scared because her husband refused for her to do anything, and only he decided what should be done. As a child bride, Gloria also endured the terror and pain of an unwanted physical relationship. After 6 months, she discovered she was pregnant. She felt pain because her body just wasn't ready to conceive at that age, and she had no knowledge of how to deliver a baby. Alongside the sexual and physical abuse, she experienced emotional abuse almost every day, which still has an impact on her.
Oh, I remember that story. After the death of her husband, she was left alone with a baby. She couldn't back home because her community would not accept her back and they would shame her. Fortunately, she is safe now. However, she is still struggling with the consequences. Now, just imagine how many women and girls experience this.
See, that's right. I think we all have like a general idea of what trafficking and forced marriages are, but outside of the general understanding we have of these problems, I think we miss just how pervasive and psychologically traumatizing they are.
And I think the resolutions clearly states that these are the urgent problems and those crimes related to the human rights violations of the most vulnerable members of our society. However, the data collection still remains incomplete since a huge number of crimes are still underrepresented. It's problematic to find reliable, high quality data related to the human trafficking and the profile of victims. The aspect of trustworthy reports and data was mentioned in both of the resolutions. What are the factors behind that?
That's a good question, Kami. So, when we talk about human trafficking, the most defining factor for the outdated and inappropriate data is just the legislative aspect. Since there's no specific legal definition of trafficking in persons, especially in developing countries, which leads to an absence of criminal statistics. For example, the number of police recorded crimes and the number of persons prosecuted and convicted. And if we look at the countries where trafficking receives enough legal attention, still the definition may vary from country to country, and official statistics may include or exclude different types of human trafficking.
You have mentioned a very important issue. Here is also worth mentioning the other aspect of the country's differences, because not a lot of countries can be simply due to the resource constraints, security reasons, or the presence of large scale humanitarian emergencies. However, as you mentioned in the beginning, those countries require the most attention.
See, you're absolutely right. If we look at the data collection from the forced and early child perspective, we can observe the other factor, which is cultural acceptance. Due to the lack of awareness of strong following of traditions, which leads to the normalization of the practice, and it's not perceived as a crime, and so it's not reported.
That's right. Should we look at the solutions proposed by the United Nations in terms of the data collection? And most importantly, what are the goals, United Nations goals in both of the resolutions?
Absolutely. So I'll cover the resolution on human trafficking in women and girls. The resolution calls upon states to raise the awareness of the issue and then strengthen measures to empower women and girls. It also calls for the establishment of specialized agencies dedicated to preventing and combating trafficking in persons, as well as to assisting victims. It emphasizes the engagement with local communities and grassroots organizations to build the blocks of effective national anti trafficking strategies.
Thank you, John. In my opinion, these are the very crucial actions we should look at. And if we look at the resolution of child early and forced marriage, we can see here the aspect of involving families, communities, and the religious, traditional, and community leaders who are transforming negative social norms and confronting gender inequality. Also, United Nations Future recognizes that to eliminate child early and forced marriage requires raising girls up from the poverty, insecurity, armed conflicts, humanitarian emergencies, forced displacement, and natural disasters.
All right, so welcome back, everyone. We're joined now by our guest. Can you please begin by just introducing yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Amandine Bollinger. I'm the Child Protection System Strengthening Manager at UNICEF here in Nigeria, Abuja.
Now, the United Nations really began to focus on forced child marriage back in 1940s, and obviously a lot have done and a lot have changed. But why the forced child marriage is still a global issue and it's still happening?
And you may know that Nigeria, I'll speak for Nigeria. Child marriage in Nigeria is extremely high. In the northern part of the country, you have states that have up to 95% of girls under 18 who are married. There are three countries in Africa, with Chad and Central Africa, that have the highest levels of child marriage. Why is it happening? For so many reasons. First of all, you need to put yourself in the head of the parents who marry their girls. All parents want what's good for their children. They want their, especially girls, they want them to be protected. One of the major fears of parents, and this often happens in Muslim communities, is that the child gets pregnant without being married. So marrying the child early on is a way to make sure that if the child gets pregnant, then she will be supported by her husband. It takes place also in Islamic traditions where there's a lot of issues around the age of the first spouse of the prophet. Some say that she was 6 years old, some say she was older, but also in some traditions, it's explained that while she was married, the marriage was not being consumed, so it was just for the girl to be protected. There are many interpretations, but all this combined, you also have the influence of the grandmother often and the grandparents pushing for the child to be married. There's also an economic factor that is very strong. So in these communities, often we talk about very poor families. So getting your child married off to a rich man, provides some security because you receive the equivalent of a dowry in the Indian communities. When you marry off, the bride gets some money, so the family gets off as well. And then from the men, there's also interest, obviously. So you have a lot of men who like younger girls. So that's also keeping the practice on. But whatever the reasons, there are lots of factors and lots of issues that fall into it. And one is health. You have young girls get married, they get pregnant, their body is not prepared for it, and so you have a lot of mortality and death. You have also babies who die. You have a lot of other consequences. Even if the girl doesn't die, then she can develop what we call fistulas, which means that her body is affected, and then she will, for instance, urinate at any moment. People will not allow her in the community because all of a sudden the So there are lots of implications attached to it.
And then, in general, when there is child marriage, do the children stay in their communities, or are they trafficked to like other parts of the country or abroad, or do they mostly stay within their communities?
That depends. Most of the time, it is within the community. The parents know the husband to be, it's been arranged, it's a traditional setting, and if the husband travels, then he will take his wife, but it remains within the community. But it can also happen that it would be a marriage arranged with someone who lives in another state. So the bride would be a little bit cut off from her family, but still it remains within the family. I would say more traditionally, when the child is married, even if it's abroad, it's less part of a trafficking system. It's more they marry off the girl based on the reputation of the husband, and because once again they want what's good for their daughters. The problem becomes when the girl is rejected by the husband and is divorced, and that's often the case, especially when she starts having those health problems that I mentioned, or if she's being difficult, then or if the husband just wants to have another wife, then divorce can occur. And divorced women or divorced girls are very bring shame to the community and to the family, and so often they will go to other states and they're very isolated, and this is when trafficking can start. Some of them will even become sex workers. They can really because they would go to cities try to survive. So then problems start.
We also wanted to ask you about the profile of victim. What is the typical victim profile is like?
Well, many of them are from poor family backgrounds, as I said, Muslim in most cases, although you will also have a different type of marriage that can take place, which is not in the Islamic world but in the Christian world, where this is completely for economic reasons, where a poor family will marry off a child even before the child is born. So say you have you're a grandma, your daughter is going to give birth soon, you will marry off the daughter of your daughter to a rich family. So this can happen as well for economic reasons. Um, I would say roughly this is the case, and often girls also do not go to school, so they are uneducated. And this is an area we try to advocate for the education of girls, trying to keep them in schools as long as possible to delay the age of marriage. They can be very young, so most of the girls who are married are above 15, between 15 and 18 when we talk about child marriage. Because for us, a child is anyone below 18, as per the UN resolution. But you also have girls who will be below 15, and that can go down to very young ages, which again doesn't mean that the marriage is going to be consumed. But it's usually between 10 and 15 girls have been married.
And then, so you said that part of your work is trying to encourage families to keep their daughters in school. What is the challenge there that you face getting families to do that? Is it just like the money thing, or like it's very expensive to be sending your children to school? Is that what it is?
That's a very good question. Expenses can be one of them, but the main issue is that in those areas which are very poor again and very deprived, there's not many schools. So, and when there are schools, the quality of the education is not great. Sometimes the teacher himself is not the best, or can even impregnate women. So you don't want to send your child to school and then she gets pregnant by a teacher. You may as well marry her off to a man who will take care of her security. So the quality of education is one. The availability of schools is a second criteria. So we work a lot on trying to ensure that children have access to quality education wherever they are. Then there's also, you can have schools. The schools can be safe, but then going to the schools can be complicated for the girls, either because on the way to school they can be attacked, so the parents do not want to send them there, or because it's too far and they would have to travel for too long. Then education itself is supposed to be free, but you're right. It's there's an element of economic element as well that is attached to it for families to pay. But there's also that when you have a girl at home who can do a lot of work for the household, it helps the house, and it's more useful for the household than having the girl going to school. And then there's the education of the parents themselves. If they're not educated, they don't understand the use of schools and what it will bring to the child. So the issue is really multiple.
And apart from the educational challenges, what other challenges you face in terms of working with to eliminate the forced child marriage?
I'm still speaking about the Nigeria context because, of course, you would have countries like India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, where child marriage is also very high, but the context would be, or even Somalia, Eritrea, context would be different. Here, I'm really talking about Nigeria and to some extent West Africa. The challenge, one of the major challenge we have in terms of resistance is cultural or traditional or religious, I would say. It's very taboo and it's very difficult to bring the word child marriage. It also goes with the understanding of child rights in general, because the word rights is often understood as a Western concept being imposed by Western countries and not how local communities want to approach the education of their children. So, just without even understanding the concept behind it, there's a rejection by Western norms. Then there is definitely a religious component where it's very sensitive because the interpretation of the Quran can be various. And so this is not an area that is easy to discuss. We need to make it open to discuss with communities, especially imams and religious leaders. There's also, to some extent, a political factor because in those states, in the northern part of the country, Nigeria, many of the governors or the political actors are supported by the religious leaders. So it's difficult for them to pass laws that will ban child marriage. And some of the political influencers are themselves married to girls. So it makes it very taboo and difficult for them to talk about it. Beyond those two factors, there's the economic factor that I mentioned, which is very difficult to breach, and that could go through, I guess, through cash transfer or cash support for girls to attend school, for instance. And then sometimes you have girls themselves who want to be married, who would try to get married because they feel this is how they will grow, they will be accepted by their communities. They see what a married woman looks like and they want the same thing until they realize what it implies.
That was awesome. Thank you very much.
Okay, my pleasure.
That was really informative, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was great. So, Kami, before we wrap up, I think it would be useful to take a look at three different countries. So, every year, the US Department of State releases a trafficking in persons report. It's a pretty intense look at each country's efforts to combat trafficking. There are four tiers. So, tier one countries have best practices, and then tier two countries are making improvements. Tier two watch list countries are those countries that are not quite a tier two, but they are making improvements. And then tier three countries are making little effort. So today, let's look at Afghanistan, which is really struggling to combat human trafficking. So they're at tier three. Mexico, which is improving. So they're at tier two. And then Georgia, which is considered a model state at tier one. So what can you tell us about Afghanistan?
Well, as we know, Afghanistan has struggled with the stability for decades now, so it might not come as much as a surprise that they struggle to control human trafficking as well. So first off, Afghanistan have made some progress. The government does make some attempts to identify trafficking victims and occasionally pursues persecution on traffickers. However, the traffic victims fear the police, as some have been arrested for the moral crimes. And parts of the Afghanistan struggle to end a practice called bachabazi, literally boys' play. Although technically illegal, these laws are rarely enforced, with even some authorities taking part of it. One recommendation of U.S. State Department is just the government and the Afghanistan National Child Protection Community identify and remove public servants implicated in bachabazi.
Right, and care for trafficking victims comes exclusively from international funded NGOs. So, of course, instability in Afghanistan makes working there perilous, especially for people that are not Afghan. So, unfortunately, care for boy trafficking victims is sometimes unavailable. They can be turned over to orphanages. However, orphanages sometimes operate as traffickers.
Exactly. When it comes to trafficking prevention, the government shows an unwillingness to really put effort into prevention strategies. The High Commissioner, which is an autonomous collection of the representative from different ministers, was scheduled to meet quarterly, but in 2019, the last available numbers, and 2018, the commission only met once with space attendance.
In Afghanistan, trafficked victims are men, boys, women, and girls. Most are trafficked within Afghanistan, however, often as debt payment. Trafficked victims are forced into a variety of roles, from textile manufacturing to building to sexual slavery. Some children are also forced into combat or combat support roles by the Taliban or the Islamic State in Khorasan province.
And traffickers include government and military officials, community elders, and private citizens. Police, especially checkpoint police, are known to be involved in the trafficking of boys for bachabazi.
Afghanistan is an informative case study, I think. So we see both a disinterest in confronting trafficking within the government and complicity, especially at lower levels of law enforcement. Afghanistan also struggles to end bakabazi, a practice that stretches back for centuries.
Now, Mexico is labeled as improving by the US State Department. What are they doing right now? Are there areas for the improvement?
So, Mexico, by the US State Department's parameters, isn't doing enough to end trafficking, but the country is working hard to reach that standard. So, the good is that Mexico has a new accusatory system. It is working to identify more trafficking victims at home and abroad, and it prosecutes government officials involved in trafficking. And it cooperates with its neighbors, especially the United States. Mexico is also providing more and better resources to victims and has created a hotline for investigating referrals. However, resources for victims are still lacking, especially in some regions of the country. On occasion, the government accidentally detains some victims during operations, and it is not devoting enough resources to prosecuting forced labor.
And also, the government showed willingness to cooperate with Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, and the Bahamas. And the Minister of Finance received 364 reports of suspicious financial transactions that might indicate trafficking operations. The most since the Financial Intelligence Unit began these operations in 2003. The Ministry of Finance also held training related to the money laundering and has increased its collaboration with the Organization of American States.
Yes, there were problems, however, with collaboration between states in Mexico. So, except for three standout states, there were limited numbers of investigations. And when an investigation did take place, there was a lack of coordination between agencies. So, budget cuts have also limited the number of personnel in rural and indigenous communities, which, of course, are especially susceptible to trafficking.
Overall, on the federal level, Mexico is really doing an impressive job. The problem seems to lay with the local efforts.
Yeah, and I think one of the really big takeaways is just how vital local authorities are to combating trafficking. When it comes to actual prevention, local authorities and community leaders are key partners. With that, let's take a look at Georgia, which the US holds as a model country.
Yeah, so Georgia has been considered as a Tier 1 country by the US State Department since 2016. The government has been identifying more victims, providing them with more aid, and as importantly, prosecuting more traffickers.
Okay, so all that alone is just enough to make them a tier one country?
Well, is doing some really victim focused work. For example, there is our crisis centers in 5 cities. These centers provide shelters, medical and mental health care, and legal support for the potential victims of trafficking, while their cases are investigated by authorities.
Right, and then for identified victims, the government provides further care, including childcare, reintegration support, and a one-time financial payment. Child victims receive the same support, but it's specifically tailored to assist children.
Exactly. Also, the victims of trafficking were not persecuted for any crimes they might have been forced to commit. Foreign victims were also granted a 1 year visa. The government also provides reparation support to the Georgian victims in the foreign countries and foreign victims in Georgia.
And then when it comes to prevention, Georgia did have public awareness campaigns that targeted some segments of society, but the government did not initiate any large scale campaigns in major cities out of a fear of hindering tourism. The government also operates a hotline.
Yeah, there is still work to be done, however. For starters, Georgia needed to provide more legal support for the victims, like remote testifying. Currently, if victims wants to be part of the legal actions against their trafficker, they need to stay in the country. This is, of course, hindered cooperation from foreigners who might very well want to return home. The country also need to commit more resources to combating trafficking in the labor sector.
Mhm. And the country also needs to devote more resources towards training authorities in spotting suspicious financial activity, breaking up organized crime outfits, and tracing digital evidence.
So, my takeaways for the best practices included really robust victim service and better investigative tools, right?
Yeah, I think that really is what separates Georgia from Mexico is much better victim services. One thing though that I think is missing from these reports is really the necessity of development in poor communities.
Yeah, you're right. And trafficking and forced marriage really rely on desperation. That sometimes we should not lose focus on. Public awareness campaign, reduce investigative bodies, and strong victim services are important, but they all need to be tied with developing opportunities and improving communities if we are going to end human trafficking.
If you'd like to learn more about the trafficking of women and girls and child early and forced marriage, please seek out the UN Office on Drugs and Crime and the Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner.
In addition to the United Nations resolutions and various offices, we would also like to thank the American Journal of the International Law, the US Department of State, and the American Society of International Law.
This has been Through the Lens. Have a great week.
And with that, we have come to the end of today's episode. A big thank you to all of the listeners. We will be back with another discussion next week. Please don't forget to subscribe and share. And for the curious ones, visit us at Willy Brandt's Bulletin page for more episodes.